You are listening the Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin by Benjamin Franklin, narrated by Litnarrate. Welcome to Litnarrate. Sit back and enjoy classic literature brought to life through narration. Imagine a boy who owns nothing, who arrives in a strange city with damp clothes, a few coins in his pocket, and not one single friend to call on. Now imagine that same boy, decades later, sitting at a table with kings, shaping the birth of a nation, and being celebrated across 2 continents as one of the sharpest minds of his age. That transformation is not a fairy tale. It really happened, and the man who lived it left behind his own account of exactly how he did it. By the end of this episode, you will understand the mindset shifts, the daily habits, and the surprisingly simple decisions that turned an ordinary runaway apprentice into Benjamin Franklin, one of history's great self-made men. Stick with us, because the biggest lesson is not what you think, and it shows up near the very end. Let's set the scene. We are in colonial America, a world without safety nets, without formal schooling for most people, without any guarantee that hard work would lead anywhere at all. Franklin was born into a large, poor family in Boston, one of 17 children. His father made candles and soap for a living, a trade that was steady but far from glamorous. From the very beginning, young Benjamin showed 2 things that would define his entire life: an almost insatiable hunger for reading, and a stubborn independence that refused to accept the path other people expected him to walk. His father originally intended him for the church. Franklin was sent to grammar school briefly, and he actually excelled, rising quickly to the top of his class. But the cost of a full education was too much for a family with that many mouths to feed, so those plans were quietly dropped. Instead, Franklin was pulled into the family candle-making business, a trade he despised. He dreamed of the sea, of adventure, of anything other than dipping wicks into wax all day. His father refused to let him go to sea, worried reasonably that his son would be lost to danger and distance. So a compromise was struck. Franklin would be apprenticed to his older brother, James, who ran a print shop and was starting a newspaper. Here is where the story gets interesting, and where the first real lesson begins to take shape. Franklin did not love his brother's authority over him. James treated him more like hired help than family, and there were beatings, harsh words, and constant friction. But something remarkable happened inside that print shop. Franklin fell in love with words. He had access to books through the other apprentices in town, borrowing volumes at night, staying up reading until dawn, then sneaking the books back before anyone at the bookshop noticed they were missing. He taught himself to write by studying a magazine called The Spectator, essentially reverse engineering great writing. He would read an essay, jot down brief notes on the ideas, set it aside for a few days, and then try to reconstruct the entire piece from memory using only his notes. Then he would compare his version to the original and study exactly where his writing fell short. Think about what that method actually represents. This was not passive reading. This was active practice, deliberate repetition, real-time feedback, the exact same principles that modern experts in skill acquisition still teach today. Long before anyone had a phrase like deliberate practice, a teenage boy in a Boston print shop invented his own version of it, purely because he wanted to get better and was too poor to hire a tutor. That is lesson number 1 from Franklin's life. When you cannot afford formal instruction, you can often build your own curriculum out of raw curiosity and discipline. The tools available to any of us today, free videos, free books, free communities, dwarf what Franklin had access to, and yet he outworked almost everyone around him using scraps. He also experimented constantly with his own habits, in ways that feel oddly modern. As a teenager, he tried a vegetarian diet after reading a book that recommended it, mostly because it let him save money on food, and he used those savings to buy even more books. He noticed that eating lightly left his mind sharper for study. This is a young man essentially running self-experiments on his own body and mind, testing what made him more productive, decades before anyone used the phrase self-optimization. It is a small detail, but it tells you everything about how Franklin approached his own life. Nothing was fixed. Everything was testable. If a habit did not serve his goals, he changed it without sentimentality. But life with his brother eventually became unbearable. James was legally allowed to control Franklin under the terms of their apprenticeship contract, and Franklin, chafing against that control, eventually broke the agreement and fled Boston entirely, sailing to New York and then walking and boating his way to Philadelphia. He arrived in that city as a complete unknown, exhausted, dirty, hungry, carrying almost nothing. He famously walked down the street, eating a large bread roll, looking so awkward and out of place that the young woman who would later become his wife saw him and, by his own account, thought he looked utterly ridiculous. There is something almost cinematic about that image. The future statesman, scientist, and diplomat, in his very first moments in the city that would make him famous, looked like nothing more than a lost, hungry teenager. This is where we hit lesson number 2, and it is one of the most powerful ideas in the entire story. Reputation is built brick by brick, through small, consistent actions, not through grand gestures. Franklin got work at a print shop in Philadelphia. He was talented, but talent alone was not what made people trust him. He made a deliberate choice to be seen as industrious. He famously wheeled his own paper purchases through the streets on a wheelbarrow rather than have them delivered, specifically so that people in town would witness him working hard with their own eyes. He avoided taverns, avoided idle amusements, dressed plainly, and paid his debts on time. Merchants noticed, suppliers noticed, and slowly opportunities began flowing toward him, not because of one lucky break, but because of a carefully constructed pattern of visible reliability. In our modern world, we tend to obsess over personal branding, over crafting the perfect online image, the perfect highlight reel. Franklin's approach offers a quieter, sturdier alternative. Instead of manufacturing an image, he simply built the underlying reality and let people observe it. If you are actually diligent, actually honest in your dealings, actually careful with money, you do not need to perform those qualities because the people around you will notice them naturally over time. It is a slower path than a viral post, but it is a far more durable one because reputations built on genuine behavior are much harder to shatter than reputations built on carefully staged appearances. Franklin's early career in Philadelphia was far from smooth. He was manipulated by a colonial governor who promised to fund his own printing business, sent him to London on the strength of that promise, and then simply never delivered the letters of credit he had guaranteed. Franklin found himself stranded in London with almost no money, forced to work as a common laborer in a print shop just to survive. It would have been easy, completely understandable even, for him to spiral into resentment or despair. Instead, he treated the setback as an unplanned education. While working in London, he studied printing techniques he had never encountered before. He built new professional relationships, and he continued reading voraciously in every spare hour. When he finally sailed back to Philadelphia roughly 18 months later, he returned not defeated, but sharpened. This pattern repeats again and again throughout his life, and it is worth naming directly as lesson number 3. Setbacks were treated as raw material, not as verdicts on his worth. Franklin lost money to unreliable business partners. He lost money to friends who borrowed and never repaid him. He was betrayed by people he trusted. And every single time, instead of retreating into bitterness, he analyzed what had gone wrong, adjusted his approach, and kept moving forward. He later referred to these mistakes in his own life using a printer's term, calling them his errata, the same word used for typographical errors that need correcting in a new edition of a book. That mental framing is worth sitting with for a moment. An erratum is not a permanent stain. It is simply an error that gets fixed in the next print run. Franklin viewed his own failures the same way, as corrections to be made, not identities to be carried forever. Once back in Philadelphia, Franklin eventually opened his own print shop with a partner, and here his business instincts truly came alive. He understood something that many business owners even today fail to grasp. Visibility and community trust compound over time. He wrote engaging content for his newspaper. He was scrupulously fair in refusing to print malicious gossip or personal attacks. even when doing so meant turning away paying customers who wanted their rivals slandered. He reasoned that his long-term reputation for fairness was worth more than any single payment, and he was right. Subscribers trusted his paper because they knew it would not be used as a weapon against them personally. That decision, prioritizing long-term trust over short-term profit, is a lesson that entire modern industries still struggle to learn. Franklin's financial philosophy deserves its own moment here because it is strikingly simple and strikingly effective. He believed in relentless frugality paired with relentless industry. Not extreme deprivation, but disciplined restraint. He and his wife Deborah ran their household modestly for years, even after Franklin had achieved real financial comfort. There is a charming little moment in his own account where his wife surprised him one morning with a silver spoon and a fine porcelain bowl for his breakfast, an unnecessary luxury that had cost her a significant sum. Franklin was almost alarmed by it, noting how easily comfort creeps into a household and expands bit by bit until modest living becomes something entirely different. He was not against enjoying the fruits of success. He was simply aware with unusual clarity of how quickly rising income can quietly swallow itself through rising spending, an insight that modern personal finance experts still repeat under a different name, lifestyle inflation. Now let's talk about the piece of Franklin's story that most beyond the most fascinating and honestly the most practically useful, his systematic project of self-improvement. At around the age of 20, Franklin decided he wanted to achieve what he called moral perfection. Not perfection in some abstract, unreachable spiritual sense, but a very concrete, structured attempt to build better habits and eliminate bad ones. He identified 13 specific virtues he wanted to cultivate, things like temperance, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, and humility. For each one, he wrote a short, precise description of what that virtue actually meant to him in practice. Here is the part that turns this from an interesting historical anecdote into a genuinely useful modern technique. Franklin did not try to master all 13 virtues simultaneously. He understood something that most people trying to change their lives completely miss. Willpower and attention are limited resources, and trying to overhaul your entire personality overnight is a recipe for failure. Instead, he focused on just one virtue per week, tracking his behavior in a small notebook with a grid, one column for each day, one row for each virtue. Every single day, he would mark a small dot next to any virtue he had failed to uphold. The goal over a full 13-week cycle was to gradually reduce the number of marks, working through the entire list roughly 4 times a year. Stop and think about how radically effective this framework still is today. Modern behavior change research consistently confirms exactly what Franklin figured out through pure trial and error nearly 3 centuries ago. Trying to change everything at once overwhelms your brain and leads to abandoning the whole project. Focusing on one habit at a time, tracking it visibly, and building on small wins is dramatically more sustainable. Franklin essentially invented a rudimentary habit tracker using nothing but a pencil, a ruled notebook, and sheer persistence, generations before anyone coined the term habit tracker or built an app for it. If you have ever used a checklist to build a new routine, congratulations, you are following a method Benjamin Franklin pioneered using ink and paper. He was also remarkably honest about which virtues gave him the most trouble. Order, meaning keeping things in their proper place and following a strict daily schedule, turned out to be his lifelong weakness. He admitted, with real self-deprecating humor, that he never fully mastered it, comparing himself to a man who wanted an axe polished perfectly bright, but eventually settled for one that was merely, in his words, speckled, because achieving flawless order simply cost more effort than the benefit was worth to him personally. There is real wisdom hiding inside that small joke. Franklin is telling us that self-improvement does not require flawless execution to be valuable. The mere act of striving, even imperfectly, made him, in his own words, a better and happier man than he would have been without attempting it at all. Progress, not perfection, was the actual engine driving his growth. Let's shift now to another defining trait of Franklin's character, one that shaped both his personal relationships and his enormous public influence, his approach to disagreement and persuasion. As a young man, Franklin was, by his own admission, argumentative almost to a fault. He loved debate, loved catching people in logical contradictions, loved the thrill of winning an argument outright. But over time, he noticed something important. Winning an argument rarely won him a friend, and it often cost him goodwill he would need later. So he deliberately retrained himself. He began abandoning dogmatic, absolute language entirely. Instead of saying something is certainly true, he trained himself to say, "I conceive this to be so," or "it appears to me at present that." Instead of directly contradicting someone and pointing out their error, he would acknowledge that their view might be correct under certain circumstances, before gently pointing out where his own perspective differed. This was not weakness, it was strategy, and an extremely effective one. Franklin discovered that people become far more receptive to new ideas when they do not feel cornered or humiliated in the process. He noted that this softer style of conversation made people more willing to actually consider changing their minds, precisely because they were not defending their pride at the same time they were defending their position. This lesson has enormous relevance today in an era of online arguments, comment section battles, and constant public disagreement. Franklin's insight was that the goal of communication is rarely to prove yourself right in the moment. The real goal, if you actually want influence and lasting relationships, is to be persuasive over time, to leave the door open for someone to change their mind later without feeling like they lost face doing it. That single shift in his communication style, moving from confrontation to gentle inquiry, became one of the quiet superpowers behind his enormous influence in the Pennsylvania Assembly and later in broader colonial and even international diplomacy. Now let's talk about something Franklin understood decades before modern social psychology gave it a formal name: the incredible power of small, low-stakes favors in building relationships. There is a wonderful moment in his own account where he describes winning over a rival political figure, someone who had actively opposed him, not through flattery, not through grand gestures, but through one small strange request. He heard that this rival owned a rare book, and he simply asked to borrow it for a few days. The man agreed. Franklin returned it promptly with a genuinely warm note of thanks. And from that point forward, the two men became lasting friends and allies. Franklin drew out the underlying principle himself, quoting an old saying, that a person who has already done you one kindness will be more willing to do you another kindness than someone you have personally done a favor for. It sounds almost backwards at first, but the logic runs deep. When someone does something for you, especially something small and easy, their brain subtly reframes the relationship. They start seeing themselves as someone who supports you, because that is what they just did. And people are remarkably consistent about wanting their actions and their self-image to line up. Psychologists today study this exact phenomenon under a very similar name, sometimes referred to as the request for a favor effect. Franklin discovered it, tested it, and used it deliberately, all without any formal psychological theory to guide him. It was pure observation of human nature, applied with precision. This brings us to one of the most fascinating threads running through Franklin's entire life, one that separates him from most ambitious, successful people throughout history: his relentless commitment to public benefit alongside private success. It would have been entirely possible for Franklin to simply grow wealthy, retire early, and enjoy a comfortable, quiet life. Instead, he treated his own success as capital to be reinvested into the community around him. Consider the sheer range of civic projects he either founded or significantly improved. He organized a volunteer fire company at a time when city fires could wipe out entire neighborhoods with no organized response whatsoever. He created a subscription library, essentially the ancestor of the modern public library system, allowing ordinary tradespeople and craftsmen, people who could never have afforded their own private book collections, to access knowledge that had previously belonged almost exclusively to the wealthy. He helped establish a hospital for the sick poor. He improved city street paving and lighting, even redesigning the physical shape of street lamps himself after noticing that the imported London-style lamps clouded with soot and became useless within hours. He proposed an academy for education that eventually grew into the University of Pennsylvania. He organized a militia for defense when the colonial government was gridlocked by political infighting. What is remarkable is not just the list itself, but the method behind almost every single project. Franklin consistently understood a subtle truth about human psychology and community organizing. People resist being told what to do by someone claiming personal credit or authority, but they respond warmly to being invited into a shared cause. He deliberately avoided presenting himself as the sole author of these ideas whenever possible, often framing proposals as coming from a group of public-spirited citizens rather than from himself individually. He explained his own reasoning plainly. If you want to accomplish something significant, especially something that requires other people's cooperation and money, put your own ego aside and let the project itself take center stage. He noted that if you stay humble about credit, sometimes someone more vain than you will step forward to claim it, and even then, envy will eventually correct the record and give credit where it is actually due. In other words, do the work quietly and let the results speak for themselves over time. This is a profound lesson for anyone in a leadership position today, whether running a business, a nonprofit, a community group, or even just trying to get buy-in from a team at work. The instinct to take visible credit is natural, but it often actively works against you, triggering resistance and competition rather than cooperation. Franklin figured out through repeated trial that dissolving his own ego into the project itself was consistently the faster path to actually getting things built. There is also a striking story about how Franklin funded some of these civic projects that reveals his political cleverness. When he wanted the Pennsylvania Assembly to help fund a public hospital, he faced skeptical lawmakers who doubted that citizens would actually donate enough money voluntarily to make the project worthwhile. Rather than arguing directly against their skepticism, Franklin proposed a matching fund structure. He asked the Assembly to promise a specific sum of public money, but only if private citizens first raised an equal amount on their own. The lawmakers agreed, assuming this condition would protect them from ever actually having to pay, since they doubted the public would come through. Franklin then used that very promise as fuel for his fundraising campaign, telling potential donors that every single pound they gave would essentially be doubled by the government match. The psychological trick worked perfectly. Donations poured in specifically because donors felt their individual contribution carried extra weight, and the hospital was fully funded. It is an early, brilliant example of matching incentive structures, the same basic principle nonprofits and crowdfunding platforms use constantly today when they announce that a generous donor will match every contribution up to a certain amount. Let's turn now to Franklin's scientific pursuits, because they reveal yet another dimension of his mindset, one built entirely around curiosity without ego. Franklin became genuinely obsessed with electricity after seeing some crude demonstrations while traveling. At the time, electricity was viewed by most educated people as little more than a strange parlor trick, a source of amusing sparks and static shocks with no serious practical application. Franklin took it seriously as a subject worthy of rigorous investigation, running careful, methodical experiments corresponding constantly with scientific contacts in London, and eventually proposing and conducting his now legendary kite experiment, demonstrating that lightning itself was simply a powerful form of the same electrical force he had been studying in miniature in his own home. What is easy to miss in the famous kite story is just how much patient, unglamorous groundwork came before it. Franklin spent years running smaller, less dramatic experiments, sending detailed letters describing his findings, and initially being met with outright dismissal from the scientific establishment in London. His early papers were reportedly laughed at by some members of the Royal Society when first read aloud. It was only after his ideas gained traction in France, after prominent European scientists independently verified his theories through their own experiments, that the same English scientific community that had mocked him initially came around and eventually awarded him one of the highest honors in experimental science of that era. Franklin never let that early ridicule stop his work, and he never wasted his energy trying to argue point by point with critics in lengthy public disputes. Instead, he trusted that solid, repeatable experimental evidence would eventually win the argument on its own merits, and it did. This is a lesson worth sitting with in our current era of instant public criticism and online pile-ons. Franklin's response to being dismissed was not to escalate a public fight defending his reputation. It was to keep quietly doing rigorous work and let objective results speak louder than any argument ever could. He specifically mentions choosing not to respond to a French critic who published an entire book attacking his theories, reasoning that his experiments could be independently repeated and verified by anyone, so defending them through debate was simply unnecessary. Truth, tested through repeatable evidence, does not need a lawyer. There is also something wonderfully generous in how Franklin handled his own inventions. When he designed an improved heating stove that used far less fuel while warming rooms more effectively, the governor of Pennsylvania offered him an exclusive patent that could have made him significant additional money. Franklin turned it down. His stated reasoning was simple and remarkably ahead of its time. Since he personally benefited so much throughout his life from inventions created by other people, he felt a responsibility to freely share his own inventions in return, without trying to profit from every single idea. This was not naivety. Franklin was an extremely capable businessman who understood money deeply. This was a genuine philosophical stance about the purpose of innovation, one that echoes strongly through the modern open source movement, where programmers and inventors freely share their work specifically because they believe collective progress benefits everyone, including themselves, more than jealously guarded individual profit ever could. Now, no honest account of Franklin's life would be complete without acknowledging his very real flaws and contradictions, because pretending otherwise would strip away much of what makes his story genuinely useful rather than just inspirational. Franklin was, in his younger years, notably careless with the feelings of people who trusted him. He neglected the young woman, who would eventually become his wife for so long during his time in London that she gave up waiting and married someone else, a decision that led to real heartbreak and complications later. He borrowed money that he sometimes struggled to repay on time. He admits candidly to using questionable trickery on a friend during a friendly literary competition, secretly submitting a piece of writing as his own that was actually composed by someone else, purely to prove a point in a debate about talent. But here is what makes Franklin's account genuinely valuable rather than simply flattering. He wrote about these mistakes himself, openly, without excessive self-flagellation, but also without hiding from them. He used the printer's term errata specifically because he understood something crucial about personal growth that many people miss entirely. An error acknowledged and corrected becomes useful information. An error hidden or denied becomes a permanent flaw, quietly repeating itself over and over because it was never properly examined. Franklin's willingness to name his own failures calmly and without excessive drama is itself a skill worth learning. Growth requires an honest inventory of where you have actually fallen short, not a polished highlight reel presented for other people's approval. Let's talk about one more crucial thread running through this entire story. Franklin's approach to relentless, structured learning throughout his entire adult life, long after formal schooling had ended for him. He taught himself French, Italian, and Spanish as an adult, using a clever trick where he and a friend played chess and required the loser of each game to complete a language-learning task before their next meeting, turning tedious study into a low-stakes competitive game. He later discovered that after learning those Romance languages, reading Latin, which he had briefly studied and abandoned as a child, suddenly became far easier than he expected. From that experience, he developed a genuinely interesting educational insight, arguing that the traditional method of forcing children to start with difficult classical Latin before moving to modern languages might actually be backwards, and that starting with more accessible modern languages first could build confidence and skill that would make Latin easier to pick up later, rather than the reverse. That specific observation about language learning sequencing is a small detail, but it captures something larger about how Franklin approached everything in his life. He was never satisfied simply following established convention because it was established convention. He treated even the accepted educational wisdom of his era as something worth testing against his own direct experience, and he was willing to publicly suggest that centuries of standard practice might be improved upon, based on nothing more than his own careful observation. That combination, respect for existing knowledge paired with a genuine willingness to question it when personal experience suggested something different, runs through every single chapter of his life story, from his early self-education in that Boston print shop, all the way through his groundbreaking electrical experiments decades later. So let's bring this all together, because there is a reasons Franklin's own account of his life has remained continuously in print and continuously studied for nearly 2.5 centuries now, far longer than almost any other personal memoir from that era. It is not really a story about extraordinary talent, or about lucky breaks, or about being born into privilege. Franklin was born with none of those advantages. What he had instead was a specific learnable set of habits and mental frameworks, and his own writing lays them out with remarkable clarity and honesty. He treated learning as something you could systematize, breaking down great writing into components he could practice and rebuild through deliberate repetition. He treated reputation as something built slowly through consistent, visible action, rather than through clever self-promotion. He treated setbacks and failures as correctable errors rather than permanent verdicts on his character or his worth. He treated personal growth as a structured, trackable process, focusing on one improvable habit at a time rather than attempting an overwhelming, all-at-once transformation. He treated disagreement as an opportunity for gentle persuasion rather than combative victory, understanding that people rarely change their minds while defending their pride. He treated small favors and genuine kindness as tools for building lasting alliances, understanding a piece of human psychology that modern researchers would only formally document centuries later. He treated his own success not as a finish line to relax at, but as capital to be reinvested into the community around him, building institutions like libraries, hospitals, and fire companies that outlasted him by centuries. And he treated criticism, even public ridicule, as noise to quietly outwork rather than as an emergency requiring immediate defense. None of these principles required exceptional intelligence or rare talent to apply. They required patience, honesty with yourself, and a genuine willingness to treat your own life as an ongoing experiment rather than a fixed, finished story. That, more than any single achievement, invention, or political accomplishment, is the real inheritance Benjamin Franklin left behind in his own words. A poor boy with a bread roll under each arm, walking alone down an unfamiliar street, became one of the most respected figures of his century, not through some singular stroke of genius, but through the patient, repeated application of principles that remain just as available to any of us today as they were to him nearly 300 years ago. Thank you for listening to Litnarrate. If you enjoyed this classic tale, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more timeless literature brought not to life through narration. See you in the next story.